Kids Mental Health, Pierce County. We're so grateful for you guys joining us today on this really sunny day in the Pacific Northwest. I'm glad that you guys decided to share some time with us here today. I think we'll have a great panel and an agenda for all of our participants today. So again, thank you guys for joining us. Just to give you a little bit of a background about Kids Mental Health Pierce County, we are a community collaborative that is aimed at streamlining and coordinating behavioral health services for kids, school-age kids here in Pierce County. And so since the pandemic happened, we've been hosting a series of virtual webinars aimed at supporting and understanding kids and families during the pandemic. This is actually our third webinar that we've had so far. And today we're gonna be talking about how to talk about race and social justice with our kids. And so again, I just wanna thank everybody for being here today. I do wanna cover a couple of housekeeping things just because we are in this virtual format. So just because we are doing this via Zoom, I am gonna ask everybody if you could please mute your phone or computer and your camera as well. That's gonna allow us to have the maximum bandwidth for today. However, during our question and answer section, if you wanna turn those back on, please do so. Also use that chat box. That chat box, we want you to ask questions. I do have people here and I'll be looking at that chat box to be able to ask questions. Also, we want you to be able to provide your own tips and strategies. This is a dialogue. This is a shared space for all of us to share our tips and recommendations. While we have three great panelists that are gonna give us some great recommendations and education today, we wanna hear from you too as parents and caregivers and professionals who are working with our kiddos. So please use that chat box. The meeting is being recorded, so if you do have to log out early, just know that you will be able to access this recording and any resources that we talk about that will be uploaded to the Kids Mental Health website. So before we get started, I have just a couple of poll questions that I want to ask our participants today. This will just give us kind of a better understanding of who's in the room today, as well as kind of gauging your comfortability about what we're talking about today. So I'm gonna launch those poll questions, and if you could take a couple minutes to answer them. So the first question is, what do you consider your racialized identity makeup? And then the second question is, how comfortable are you talking about race? And we will revisit that question at the end of today's webinar. If it's not letting you submit, go ahead and add that to the chat box. It looks like if you scroll down, you should be able to see that submit option. Looks like we have about 80% of people who have responded so far. Give a couple more seconds. All right, so it looks like we have about 2% who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, 6% Asian, 11% Black or African American, excuse me, 1% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, 76% white, 3% Hispanic or Latinx, 3% multiracial, and then nobody has identified as other. And then when we look at the question of how comfortable are you talking about race, 3% very uncomfortable, 7% uncomfortable, 9% neither, 71% comfortable, and 9% very uncomfortable. So thank you for those responses. I would love to be able to revisit that at the end to see if there's any changes, if you've increased your comfortability in having these conversations, and also just to get your general feedback. All right, so as we move forward today with our panel, I think it's important to note that this webinar is intended to be a forum for discussion for ideas and for learning about different viewpoints and not for debate. The first step to eliminating racism and inequality is to talk about it openly and honestly, which we're about to do. Today, as we engage in this forum, it's important to remember that each of us have multiple identities, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, class, ability, and that we also always don't know another person's identities and experiences from their physical appearance. Our goal for today is to create a space in which individuals can express and listen to each other's lived experiences. Through this dialogue, we hope that there is opportunity where both your experience and someone else's are incorporated into a larger communal narrative. So I think moving forward with the conversation, it's just important for us to have some community agreements. And I encourage you to add any community agreements that you think are important for today in the chat box as well. And just with team agreements, it really helps participants work together in a way that honors each other. And when inevitable challenges emerge, helps us to return to a sense of aligned purpose. So today, as we talk, I think it's important for us to agree that we're going to recognize that we must strive to overcome historical and divisive biases such as racism in our society. We're going to acknowledge that we are all systemically taught misinformation about our own groups and about members of other groups. This is true for everyone, regardless of our groups. I ask that we share no blame. We agree not to blame ourselves or others for the misinformation we have learned, but to accept responsibility for not repeating misinformation after we have learned otherwise. I ask that we respect each other. We agree to listen respectfully to each other without interruptions. We acknowledge that we may be at different stages of learning on the content and discussion topics. We're going to talk from our individual lenses and talk about individual experiences. We agree that no one should be required to or expected to speak for the whole race or gender. We can't, even if we wanted to. And trust. Everyone has come to the table to learn, grow, and share. We will trust that people are doing the best they can. We acknowledge once again that we may be at different stages of learning on the topic. And we are not experts. I am not an expert. I am here to facilitate the process, and everyone in the group, I think, is here to learn. Let's be be mindful of intent versus impact. We may have the intent not to do harm, but some groups or individuals may be impacted, and some groups may be impacted from us bringing up historical oppressions. Are there any other community agreements that we need to acknowledge before we move forward with today's panel presentation? Well, again, thank you all for being here today. I think we have a great panel who I'm so excited to have here today, who agreed to volunteer their time to share their experiences and information with us today. And the first person that we're going to hear from today is Dr. Genesee Temple. And just so to give you a brief bio of Dr. Temple, Dr. Genesee Temple is a licensed and practicing psychologist at the University of Delaware. Dr. Temple earned her BA in psychology from Eastern Washington University. Go Eagles, you know I had to throw that in there. And completed her doctorate in counseling psychology at Washington State University. She has been in the field since 2013 and has extensive experience working with students in higher education settings. She is particularly passionate about teaching others how to overcome adversity in order to live a more authentic life and actualize their potential. Dr. Temple is continuously looking for creative avenues to bring her passion for well-being to others and has recently launched a YouTube channel dedicated to discussing mental health, education, and other various topics. She practices from a multicultural and interpersonal framework, which utilizes therapy, consultation, teaching, and outreach as her tools to help others. So thank you again, Dr. Temple, for being here. I'm again going to ask everybody to mute their camera if they're not speaking, as well as their audio, and I will turn it over to you, Dr. Temple.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So 1 second so I can pull up the document. Okay. So I wanted to spend some brief time talking about discussing race and building a healthy racial self-esteem. And I want to first, jump in with why it's important to talk about race. I think everybody who is here this afternoon and sharing time with us understands that it is important to have dialogue around race. And I wanted to give kind of like this biological, psychological reason for why we need to talk to our youth from a young age about this. So I, had borrowed this quote from Dr. Aisha White, who works in the Office of Child Development at the University of Pittsburgh. And so, research has shown that by about 2.5 years old, children can start developing and observing racial biases. And that's pretty young. So they are starting to recognize that people are treated differently on the basis of their skin. They cannot articulate it in a sophisticated way, but they are starting to note and observe what is happening in their world. And then once they get close to school age, so 4 to 5 years old, they begin to exhibit said behaviors. We know that racism is taught, these behaviors are observed and learned and then enacted. And so not only are children by that age being able to exhibit these behavioral and thought biases, they can also be impacting their peers who can also begin to feel discriminated against because of their skin color. And to further illustrate this, I didn't put it on the slide, but in the 1940s, Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted the famous doll studies. And in that study, a white baby doll and a black baby doll were placed in front of Black students, and they were very young, around this age, and they were asking the children about positive attributes. So they would ask, who is prettier, who is smarter, who is better? And I think about all of the Black children in the study pointed to white dolls. And then when they would ask who is bad, who isn't smart, all of the children pointed to Black dolls. And so the basis of that research and studies that came after it is what was presented in the Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate schools. So all this is information to let us know that kids start to absorb this information early, and it can have very detrimental effects on their psyche and how they operate within our society. And so for parents, caregivers, educators, etc., before we can even engage in this dialogue with our children, our students, etc., it's really important for us to have an awareness of our own privilege and marginalized identities. We all hold identities that are privileged in our US context, and we all hold identities that are marginalized. And because of our different identities, we operate in our system, in our societal system differently. And Ashley named it earlier, even people who may have, similar identities could still experience the world differently. Just because someone doesn't look like they belong to a certain group doesn't mean that their experiences are not real or valid. And so these identities that we hold and how we perceive our identities and how we perceive others' identities exist within every space that we occupy, and especially the spaces we occupy with youth. So if I have certain feelings about what it means to be a Black woman, when I'm interacting in my, in therapy with clients, those things are going to come out. If I'm teaching, those beliefs are going to come out. And so we need to really be mindful about what we're holding in terms of our own understanding of our identities and how we could be impacting the growth and ability to thrive of our youth. And so we also need to extend this awareness to our youth. They may not have a full awareness of all their identities and the complexity of said identities in the American societal context, but teaching a colorblind attitude is very harmful. When we're teaching colorblindness, we are really working to diminish the lived experiences of other people. Really, we should be teaching about our society as a mosaic and talking about how our different identities should be respected and valued. When you're teaching from the colorblind standpoint, you are not encouraging curiosity, which means you are hindering connection and understanding, which then means you're hindering youth's ability to cultivate empathy and compassion, and ultimately to be better allies to people who might experience discrimination because of their different identities. So this model is a model that I find very helpful. It was created by Dr. Pamela Hays, and it's called the addressing model. And, I just don't want to tell you all like, hey, know your identities, explore your identities, and know what's marginalized and what's privileged without giving you a map. This is easily accessible if you do a Google search. I like it because it breaks down different identities, and it's not an exhaustive list, but I think it tries to capture the big picture identities. And so it talks about age, developmental disabilities, other disabilities, religion, spirituality, ethnic and racial identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender. In the middle column, it shows you the dominant group. So really, these are the people who are, due to these identities, benefit in our society or hold more power. And it doesn't mean that other people can't move and hold some power in these spaces, but these are the people who are typically at the top when it comes to these different margin or different identities. And so as you look, our society, we value young and middle-aged adults. We value non-disabled people. We value Christianity and other secular identities, European in terms of ethnic and racial identity, upper middle class, heterosexual orientation, European Americans, US born Americans, and men. And it's really important to understand that, because when we can understand where we hold privilege, that could help us cultivate some curiosity about the experience of those who don't hold privilege. So in the furthest column, you see the non-dominant or minority group that occupies that space. And so it's really important to recognize where we hold privilege, because oftentimes if we're holding privilege in that area, we may lack awareness and knowledge regarding members of related groups that do not hold it. And it is complex. I do want to name that it can be very difficult to say, to see that you might hold power and privilege in one facet of this model and then understand how it feels to be marginalized in the same sense. And so it's really important to be reflective. And this is where this piece can come in. And this can also be extended to our youth. So how do we understand our blind spots and our own biases? So first and foremost, I want to name that as we get into this work of dismantling our own beliefs that could cause harm to others, that you might experience some shame, some guilt. You might even be really angry about it, angry that you've maybe operated in the world without that awareness, or angry that you're being confronted with your own biases. And so I want to, validate that range of emotional experience that might come up as you do this really challenging work. Socialization impacts how we engage in self-examination. Some cultures might not value, critiquing ourselves or being thoughtful and reflective in that way. We might not have been taught how to engage in that process. So that can also hinder how engaged and how deep we can go within this reflection. And this process takes time. Growth, change, dismantling things that maybe we've been operating on our whole lives is a process. And so on the right, I've kind of listed some ways in which could be helpful to you to start to do that work, which is, seeking out your own personal therapy, utilizing support groups or other groups. For instance, in my workplace, we utilize white accountability groups, people of color groups, and then we have further broken it down into racial caucus groups to further explore the inter and intra-group dynamics within our center. Self-compassion is very important to this work as well. You need to be kind to yourself and, really be gentle with your own judgments. Most of these things are, starting to be hardwired into us from the moment that we enter this world. And so really take your time and be patient with yourself as you're unlearning or reworking the way you think and operate in our society. There are also trainings and workshops, plenty of those out there available, where you can learn how to do this work and receive more support. And personally, I love journaling. I do think it's a helpful tool to help us foster deeper self-reflection. So getting to the last part of this is, what is racial self-esteem? Well, racial self-esteem is the culmination of our racial identities and our self-esteem, and it's combined. And so racial identity is the identification with people in a racialized group. And I want to emphasize this, that race is a social construct. It's not based upon any biological differences between people. It's really was a initially used to categorize phenotypical differences between humans. So in terms of like our skin tone, our hair textures, etc., but has evolved into a tool for oppression and violence. There has been research and studies and all these things conducted that have dispelled many myths that there are racial differences in intelligence, etc., and so forth. And so it's really important to understand that. And then secondly, moving to self-esteem. Self-esteem is just our own judgments of ourselves based on our own values, our internal judgments, and external sources. So other people can impact how we feel about ourselves. So thinking about racial self-esteem, it's about how we feel about our membership within our given racial group. And research has shown that when we have a positive connection or identification with our racialized selves in our grouping, we can reduce negative psychological symptoms such as depression and anxiety. What we have seen is that when people are fed negative images and information about their racial group, they feel more poorly about themselves and may act in harmful ways to themselves and to others, or may experience debilitating, depressive, and anxious symptoms among a myriad of other negative mental health outcomes. One great positive piece of having higher racial self-esteem is that it helps kids perform well academically. And that's really important to creating more access to good jobs in the future, having adequate education, etc. So it's really important to foster healthy levels of racial self-esteem within our youth. And just a quick practical way to do this, I wanted to offer a couple tips. And so first, exposure to historical information and literature that highlights the positive contribution of members of different racialized groups is very important. Our society, unfortunately, uses a lot of literature and historical information that was written by the people who don't have a full understanding of the full mosaic of our American history. And oftentimes we are presenting colonized, revisionist histories of people's different lived experiences here. I know a couple years ago there was an issue because a textbook distributor in Texas was calling enslaved people immigrants. And that's a problem because that erases the whole history of how African American people came to this country. So we need to decolonize the content, expose youth to writings by people of their racial groups, positive movies, positive things that highlight the contributions of their group to our American society. Discuss how they feel about their racialized identity. What are some of the beliefs that they're holding? Are they negative? Are they positive? And really work to sit with them to make space for their emotions. It's really important to not invalidate them or question why they feel that way in a way that is demeaning. Give them space to talk about how they came to this understanding and feelings about their identity. Incorporate affirmations. It's really important. Consistent positive messages about oneself is definitely a contributor to healthy self-esteem. So really help children learn how to articulate positive things about themselves. And then lastly, help them explore and process their own experiences of discrimination and remind them that these experiences are not due to anything that they've done wrong, but are a symptom of societal injustice. It's really important to affirm our youth when they are experiencing discrimination on any form, in any form. And so that's my spiel. I know we had to keep it pretty short. So if there are questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me via email. And also feel free to check out my other platforms where I offer more information. And I will stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Temple. That was really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Information. And Dr. Temple will be around later for our question and answer portion of the panel. So if you do have questions, I am going through the chat box. Feel free to send those through and we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. So at this time, I'm going to transition to our next participant. We have Whitney Miller. And Whitney, can you see my screen? And you'll want to unmute yourself too. All
I
right.
always forget the unmute. Can you see me?
Yeah. So let
Okay.
me introduce Whitney. So Whitney Miller is a licensed independent clinical social worker with over a decade of experience advocating for the needs and rights of children and families impacted by various systems to include the foster care and court systems. Presently, Whitney works for Tacoma General Hospital in the neonatal intensive care unit, supporting and addressing the needs of families with critically ill infants, many with complex psychosocial situations. Whitney is committed to addressing racial disparities and implicit bias in the healthcare system, specifically for pregnant and parenting families. Whitney moonlights as a therapist working for children who have experienced childhood trauma and focuses on providing culturally responsive care. Whitney is a wife, mother of 3, and advocate committed to using her voice to call for police accountability with the goal of helping to create safer communities for our children to grow. I'm so happy to have Whitney as part of this panel, and so I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, perfect. So let me go ahead and share my screen and I'll get my little slides going. Yep. Okay. All right, does that look okay?
Yes.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Ashley. And thank you, Dr. Temple and Dr. Webster for being in this panel with me. We got a chance to chat yesterday for a little bit and I really feel super honored to be invited to speak on a topic that is something that I'm really passionate about. And when Ashley came to me to ask me to talk on the panel, it really was from the perspective of being a parent and a clinician, and also someone who's experienced some traumatic events surrounding race recently here in our own community. So a couple of thoughts that I just want to start out with surround just what came to my mind when thinking about racism and social justice when talking to kids. And the quote that I have on the side of the screen is something that I've not only heard a lot in my professional world, but also in my personal world as well. And so it's something that Dr. Temple touched on, but really just not utilizing the colorblind approach with our children. It wasn't until I was much older did I realize just how detrimental that can be, not only for the person that you're not being responsive to, but also myself personally. I'm biracial. My dad is Black and my mom is white. And so growing up with that sort of message from other people did lead to some confusion. And so I just bring that up as a place of where I'm coming from. And also I'm coming from a place of recognizing that there's some families that have never had to have this conversation with their kids before. So it can feel really scary. And there's also families like my own now where it's very much our lived experience and woven into our daily living. And just to point out about racism is really the prejudice and power piece, and it's woven through every system that we encounter and every system that I've been a part of, whether it be work related or out in the community. It's woven everywhere. And I think the recent events in our world have really brought that to the surface, just how deeply embedded racism is. So what I'm going to do is go through a couple strategies that I've found helpful for myself personally and what I share with other people who are looking for just some help and guidance in moving forward. And it's something that has already been touched on, but as parents, we need to recognize our own biases and assess our own comfortability with discussing racism and social justice before we can really begin to have that conversation with our kids. I know in just speaking to my mom about this topic, you know, it was something that she didn't really think would need to be, it wasn't part of her experience as an older white woman. and her growing up wasn't part of her experience. And so we've had a lot of great conversations, just talking about what our biases are and gauging our own level of comfortability talking with each other. And so I think we really have to be able to have those conversations with other people, peer to peer, before we can really have an impact on our kids. And recognizing that growth in this area is continual, it's ever evolving. It's not going to be, you know, one day you just reach the pinnacle of being able to talk about race and social justice. There's always going to be something new and different experiences that impact and shape our view. So one of the main strategies that I think is super important is creating safety for kids. And so safety is looked at both in my perspective as both a physical space and an emotional space. And this is because each person's experience is so personal and unique to them. For a lot of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, there's a lot of pain and frustration, anger, and confusion, especially for our kids. And these are all common feelings and emotions that they need a place and space to process those. As a parent, I would say being authentic and validating their experiences, and also being comfortable that we don't always have the answers. One of the examples that I like to use actually happened recently with my son, who's 8 years old, and we had a pretty traumatic experience. My brother-in-law was killed in police custody here in Tacoma on March 3rd of this year. And so when that situation happened, we had to have a very sit-down, pointed conversation with our kids about what happened. And from that grew additional questions that we let them lead those questions, and ask what they felt comfortable with, and stopped when they felt comfortable, when they were just done. Oftentimes when talking about race with our kids or issues of social justice, it's not a one-time sit down, this is the talk. It's continual. And I think when we've really reached the point of weaving and incorporating aspects of social justice and just our day-to-day life is when it becomes natural, and it doesn't have to be that scary conversation. And so the example of my son hearing the siren and trying to differentiate whether it was a police or an ambulance, and having to help him process that, and just allowing him to express himself, and just being present and validating his emotions and his experience. So that's one, I think, tip or strategy that I can provide from my own personal experience as a parent, but leaning on my clinical skill set, which sometimes is hard to do as parents. You know, we just never really know if we're doing the right thing. So this is what I've found to help in situations like this. The next strategy is storytelling. So unlearning the dominant narratives that we've been taught. I can think of just, you know, how many people probably in my age bracket grew up learning about the Native Americans and the Pilgrims, and that it was a joyful occasion when they came together for Thanksgiving. And then years and years later, learning that really wasn't the case, and how shocking that was, that we just weren't taught the accurate information. And so really trying to undo those years, I think, within ourselves, but also doing that for our kids and making sure they're getting the accurate information and the accurate history. So using historical examples of inequities and having conversations with your kids about it is a tip that I think is helpful, especially when navigating these challenging times. And also pointing out that even though that happened in the past, it's still happening today. And it's not just a one-off, it's not just a, oh, it happened one time. This is continual. And so I bring up this scenario with my brother-in-law because it's something that's so deep and personal to me and my family. But talking about what happened here with Uncle Manny, it's not a one-off. It happens a lot. And so having those conversations with my kids when they're ready and when they have questions is something that has been helpful. And utilizing storytelling techniques is also a good way to paint pictures for kids. And this picture actually on the right-hand side is like a memorial mural that was done up in Seattle. So the last strategy that I want to share is just exposure. Taking a look at what you have in your home or what your children have access to, and really taking a look and seeing, like, what is this information that my kids are absorbing, reading, looking at, watching, even when I'm maybe not around. I know when George Floyd was murdered, there was a huge influx of comments on the game Roblox. My kids play Roblox, and there's a chat box, and there was people just commenting Black Lives Matter and different things on the chat box. And my kids were more curious about that. Like, what does that mean? Like, why would they not? And so I had to kind of think about that and what was being said. And so processing what my kids are seeing and hearing with, you know, what I want them to be understanding and knowing about what's happening in our world can be tricky when we're not always present to hear or see what's going on. So incorporating different books, movies, and art into your home and into your kids' space that are representative of different experiences are really important. Allowing kids to participate in different social justice activities with you and making it a family thing. My kids have been, I'm more selective of what they engage with and participate in, but vigils are a way that kids can be a part of an experience that collective coming together, and also that collective pain that's part of their identity as well. I think is super important for kids to be able to have that experience and not be denied that experience. But also, you know, I talked to my sister-in-law who has small kids, and, you know, we're not at different ends of the spectrum, but her comfortability of what she wants her kids to be exposed to in regards to this is different than mine. And that's okay. There's no right or wrong. I think the only, and I hesitate to even call it a wrong, is just not saying anything and just staying silent. I think that's probably the worst thing we could do. But doing it in small chunks and small doses, connecting with groups of people, and getting your kids involved, I think is another way to collectively learn and just increase that level of comfortability for kids and engaging them in the process. So lastly, I put together a list of some different resources that I have found super helpful, and friends of mine who are in different professional settings have found really helpful. And these are in no particular order at all. And this is just for parents and anyone really for further learning on how to just continue the conversation. So one of my favorites on Instagram is The Conscious Kid. There's a ton of information on posts about social justice issues. PBS has a whole slew of videos, articles, links specific to young kids to talk about race and racism. Art is an amazing way to show and teach kids. And so I think the museum's closed right now, but the Northwest African American Museum in Seattle is an excellent resource as well. Going back to what we can do as parents and identifying our own biases, the Harvard University has the huge implicit bias project that they've been working on for many, many years, and there's like there's a test that you can take. and it really breaks it down for you so you can see maybe some of the areas that you're not aware of. So that's a great place to start for people who are just starting either on this journey, or maybe you've been on it for a little while and you want to just do a check-in. That's a great place to start. I inserted some hyperlinks. So the race, racism, and mental health resources is excellent. It's really specific to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but it's an amazing working document that has a ton of information and different books and podcasts and apps and things that you can download. And then something happened to our, let's see, I lost my page there. Something happened to our town is a children's story. That's an excellent place to start. You can order that on Amazon. And then I wanted to throw something in there just in memory of John Lewis, our civil rights leader that passed away recently. He has an excellent special on PBS that's free. It's called Get in the Way. And that's an awesome, just really inspirational piece that John Lewis is a part of. A book that I think is a great starting place, and it actually sold out everywhere in the wake of George Floyd's murder, was White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Race. And so I have actually ordered two copies of that book. I'm going to be reading it alongside my mom so that we can continue to have conversations. And then the last hyperlink is because the information can be too much at times. And I've gotten feedback from some of my white colleagues that have said, it's just so much and I don't know where to really start. So this link, the developmental stages of anti-racism with concrete actions, really breaks down each step, and it provides different things that you can do within each step. And so that's also a Google working document that people are continuing to add to. So I think that wraps it up for me. Thank you again so much for allowing me to be a part of this webinar. And I'll pass it back to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And Whitney will be around for questions, and we will make sure to upload all these materials to the Kids Mental Health Pierce County website. So you'll be able to view this recording as well as any resources that were shared by any of our participants. So I want to transition next to our next panelist, Dr. Conrad Webster. Dr. Conrad Webster is a critical race theorist, writer, organizer, facilitator, professor, and education consultant from Houston, Texas. He is founder of the Get Me to the Prom Foundation and also the co-founder of the African American Leadership Conference. In 2019, Conrad obtained his doctorate in education leadership from the University of Washington. His dissertation titled, Where Did My Black Folk Go? The Exclusion of African American Males Out of K-12 Classrooms, has been getting great reviews on his sophisticated ways to discuss racism in education. Dr. Webster facilitates workshops centered around hostility, trauma, and critical race theory, nourishing resistant voices in colonial spaces, and redefining what it means to be Black in the United States. Currently, Dr. Webster is a racial equity advancement advisor for Seattle Public Schools and an adjunct professor at Pierce College in City U. So fortunate to have him here today and so grateful for his willingness to participate, being the busy man that he is. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Webster.
Ooh, that was a long introduction. Thank you all for being here today and hearing from these wonderful, phenomenal women talk about race and how to support and heal our children through these pandemics. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is how do we get here, to talk about the effects that these children are going through with racism, and then some steps and tools for supporting and has racialized healing. So how do we get here? We are living in a dual pandemic, a racial pandemic and a viral pandemic. While one is new and viral, the other is an epidemic conditions that has been persistent over centuries. The scope of each spans the range of local community to the entire planet. Now, I'm not here just to give you talking points about pandemics, but I am here to talk about those mental health issues that our students are having due to racism. So let's focus on the racial pandemic that we are in currently right now. We're living in a Trayvon Martin era, an era of silencing and killing of Black men being normalized through YouTube viral videos, Snapchat images, tweets, and public posts that reinforces trauma that dehumanizes one's existence. And when reports come out, we see the media have a white racial framework, which encompasses stereotypes, bigotry, and narratives to discriminate. And for example, when African-American males or women of non-binary queer are killed in the streets, the media likes to pull up their, let's say, their criminal record to show that these occurrences isn't something new that happens to them. And they tend to use language like thug, brute to describe these citizens and why this was justified. And sometimes we take these racialized frameworks into our homes and into our schools. And currently in our schools, we have created a landscape of systematic racism that teaches kids to tolerate systematic racism and disassociate themselves from Black male violence. Now, I just gave you a little bit about the racialized pandemic, but let's go a little bit deeper into what racism does to kids. Racism affects kids, like Dr. Temple said and Miller said, in different ways. Children are experiencing it in the form of racial slurs. Students are feeling this from stereotypes and not seeing themselves as individuals. And students can also see, and youth can also see this, not just students, from their parents being discriminated. And when they internalize these things, it interrupts their racial identity and their self-esteem. And when their racial identity is interrupted, we start seeing students have more depression. We start seeing students act out a little bit more. And we can see these in our classrooms. And when they act out, due to zero tolerance policies that is meant to control and punish Black and brown folks in our educational system, we adultify their behaviors. And we adultify their behaviors, these kids are pushed into our criminal justice systems due to the suspension and expulsions in the schools. So how do we get to talk about moving forward and healing these kids? Well, after we come out of the racial pandemic, we're in this viral pandemic where there's not much access to having discussions like this due to systematic violence that occurs when speaking of this, protests, and also the lack of access and quality resources for our Black and brown folks due to anti-Blackness. And when we talk about anti-Blackness, we're talking about the denial and to recognize one's Black humanity. And when we have anti-Blackness, which is in each ethnic culture, it creates barriers for housing, food, jobs, economic mobility, and also the ability to discuss race. And when we don't have the ability to discuss race, we tend to navigate and use safe language for white folks to be comfortable with. Now, does that mean that's for all white people or people who are racialized as white? No, we're not saying that. But we are saying ones who are considered dominant and withhold a privilege for others not to be able to have comfortability in talking about race. And what that does is provide racial fatigue. And when people have racial fatigue, there's more, there's a less sense of empowerment and more depression being involved in that. So here's some of my tips in order for us to get to a place of racial healing and a way for us to talk about race with our children and into our schools. First, we have to first start off with a theory of where we're at in society. I like to use the critical race theory, that first, racism is present in every social configurations in our lives. When we start off with that, we know we're living in a society that is racialized, that every policy, practice, and procedures that we operate in has something to do with race. Even with our language that is given to us has something to do with race. Who are the beneficiaries and who are the non-beneficiaries. And second, we must understand that a lot of policies and practices and procedures are meant to silence our Black and brown folks, from them speaking about their counter narratives and their experience with racism in this country. 3, that there's an interest convergence in how we allow certain policies and practices to be pushed out for others to have some type of acceptance. So since the Brown versus the Board of Education, we thought desegregation was out of our society. But what that did was it allowed institutions to push out Black and brown folks from getting into to teaching more. It dismantled the Black educational schools. And when that happened, a lot of kids couldn't see themselves, not only just in the curriculum, but also seeing themselves as teachers, seeing themselves as leaders. So I'm giving you that racialized framework to start with. Then we're going to go into thinking about your positive racialized identity. When we speak about positive racial identity, you can be a person who is racialized as white and not be part of the white supremacists. So when you see yourself as a positive racial identity, you're thinking of things that you love about your race, your identified race in this country. And when you start to learn about your identified racialized race, and you have some sense of positivity in it, then you're able to understand, to move to curiosity. When we move to curiosity, that's a way for us to understand old ideas and move to new ideas. After you know about your racialized identity, we want to move away from the blame system. In this country, we tend to lean on shame, guilt, and blame for things that happened in the past. But that doesn't provide healing, and it also gives us a chance to opt out. So what I'm asking you to do is provide an action plan to that shame, guilt, and hurt. The third thing that we need to do is lean on discomfort. Racism is a very, very, very hard topic to talk about. But in order for us to get there, we have to understand the privileges that are afforded to us. We have to understand whom we are in our positionality in talking about race. And if we don't have any understanding, how do we get the understanding of it? And then third, how do we move forward from that? And we have to lean on discomfort, lean on not being in a space where everything has to go right. And I always say, love bravely. When we're loving bravely, we understand that there's going to be some things that happen. And when there's no things that happen, when there's things that happen, we're still able to push forward. And then the last thing I want to say is know whom you are as an ally. There are risks and there's comfortability and growth. And then where are other areas that we missed our point in? So as an ally, we tend to operate in a fashion to where we don't move forward, but we tend to take the name. And what I'm asking you to do is learn what it means to be an ally first. And then, some people say, learn what it means to be an ally first. And then in order to know your growth and your steps to move forward. So a lot of resources that I have for you today is Abraham Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this book talks about the creation of racialized ideas and how racialized ideas come into policies and practices and how these racial ideas, policies, and practice starts racism. And then another book I want to give you is The Understanding of How to Support Black and Brown Boys in Our Education. And this book is called We Dare Say Love, and it's about supporting our African-American males through our African-American Male Achievement Initiative, which has been operating in Oakland Unified School Districts for a couple of years and now is in the Seattle Public School District. And another thing I want to talk to you about is how do we support our school systems and providing the equitable supports that they need to look at policies and practice that hinders our kids' educational success. And a good book for that is Culturally Proficient Coaching, which strives to talk about the understanding of cultural awareness and coaching teachers to learn about their implicit bias and their microaggressions and the tools that they need to encompass to get out of transgressions that hurt our students. And that is it.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Webster. I'm going to ask the panelists to come back on video. I know that we're running a little bit short on time. However, I know we had some pre-submitted questions, and I'm also checking the chat box to see if there's any additional questions. I can't tell you guys, if you guys haven't been monitoring the chat box, there's just been a lot of gratitude in there for all three of your presentations. I think it was just great information as we continue to navigate and continue to have these discussions. I hope everybody took something that they'll be able to take home back to their professions and back to themselves to be able to have those internalized questions as well. And so we did receive a pre-submitted question from one of our participants. And so I was hoping you guys could spend a couple of minutes just very briefly answering this question. How do you address wearing of Make America Great hats and Black Lives Matter shirts in a way that don't cause biased feelings among teens in school environments and support amendment rights?
Dr. Webster?
I knew you was gonna say that. So that's a student rights issue right there. And there's three ways to look at this. First, we have to talk about the First Amendment right, which is free speech. And when we talk about free speech, they're awarded the same laws that adults are awarded. So in order for something to be censored in the school, we must first look at, is it interrupting educational process? That's first. And if it is interrupting the educational process, then there are two cases that have came out to help guide us in a way of either censoring it and having the valid educational purpose to censor, which is under the Hazelwood standard. And then we have the Tinker standard, that is a reasonable forecast of materials and substance that will disrupt. So I will provide you with those resources in a book on that. And it's called, I just had this book. If you're looking for more information on that, it's called School Law for Teachers. And it helps you understand like how to address this issue on a school level base and on a district level base. But for getting out of the lawness, I would say you have to educate your school building on how racism shows up and how these systems of oppression show up in the language that we use on our t-shirt, language that we use on our t-shirt, and non-verbal language. And these forms of expression that may harm and conflict others people's beliefs or their understanding of the world. So yeah.
Ashley, you're muted.
Ashley, your sound is muted.
Oh, I forgot to unmute myself. So I see that we are getting close to 4 o'clock, but I really want to acknowledge these questions if we have just a couple more minutes. But I know some people will have to log off. And so if you are going to have to log off, all these materials will be uploaded to the Kids Mental Health Pierce County website, including a recorded version of this webinar. And I'm sure Dr. Webster can share some of those books that he referenced as well, and we can get those uploaded to the website. So if you have to log off, again, thank you for joining us today. If you could please visit those materials on the website, it'd be greatly appreciated. But I did see that there was another question in the chat for the panel. And the question is, can someone instill a positive view of being white without being a white supremacist?
Yeah, I was just sending her a link. Sending a link for that. My apologies for saying her. But you can go, Dr. Temple.
I mean, I was going to say yes, of course. I think that when I was talking about racial self-esteem, that is for everybody. I think, of course, we don't want to diminish the contributions of our white counterparts here in the country. I think when we are talking about whiteness or Blackness or what that means, it's really important to present a full spectrum of what that means in our country. I think it's unique because white folks here have a unique history in the United States, where I think we have to talk about colonialism, we have to talk about the impacts of racism, but it doesn't need to be in a way that diminishes or devalues white people. But I think it has to be part of the conversation, understanding whiteness and the power and privilege that it holds. And I think another way to have that conversation in a healthy way is talk about how white folks can use their power and privilege to be allies and to work to, you know, be good, not saying white people are born bad, but like to be good allies to others and to dismantle some of the white supremacist spaces that many of us occupy. So yes, you can teach positive racial self-esteem to white folks. It is a little bit different because there's a lot of history that goes behind whiteness. And, you know, it's really beneficial for helping to create that compassion, connection, and allyship that's really important for moving us all forward.
I keep muting myself. Whitney or Dr. Webster, did you want to add anything to that question?
Oh, that was
No, she
beautiful.
hit it right on the dot.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll just end on this last question. How can parents help you think critically about the media and what they observe in regards to portrayals of racial incidents, and helping them to critically think about what they read, hear, and see? And I know, Whitney, you touched on that a bit.
I think it really boils down to being able or having a relationship with your kids that fosters like a safe space to be able to have open dialogue. Although my kids, I have two 8-year-olds and a 15-year-old, so 15 almost going on 21 in her mind. But if something is being said or talked about, I mean, my kids are impacted. And so knowing your kids and knowing where they're at and being able to ask them about that and them feel comfortable sharing, you know, that obviously changes as your kids get older and they may be less, you know, wanting to tell you things, but just continuing to keep that conversation open and being open to your kids' questions without judgment, I think is the best way to go about that.
Thank you. Did Dr. Temple or Dr. Webster have anything that they wanted to add to that? Thank you. I think we could stay on here all day and answer. I think that you guys have been communicating in the chat as well. Just as a closing, I just want to remind everybody that the materials will be on the Kids Mental Health Pierce County website, as well as links to all of our presenters' information, and Dr. Temple's YouTube, which I highly encourage that you check out. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. We do hope to continue these webinars on a monthly basis to continue to provide supports for parents and caregivers during a pandemic. Again, I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Webster, Dr. Temple, and Whitney, for your time today, and the education and your vulnerability and just being present and all of your connections to Pierce County. It meant a lot to me to have people from here that can share their experiences and that are invested in this community. And so again, I really thank you guys. And if there's nothing else, I am going to end today's webinar. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again to our participants. Please check out the Kids Mental Health Pierce County website for additional resources as well. All right.